Before energy meant power, before it meant force, before it meant speed or explosion, it simply existed. It moved quietly through the universe without purpose, without direction, without anything to resist it. There was no system to capture it, no structure to guide it, no life to depend on it. Energy flowed because it could, not because it was needed. And in that early universe, nothing tried to hold it still. Energy was not dramatic. It did not arrive with intention. It moved as motion itself, changing form endlessly, passing from place to place without ever stopping to matter. There was no inside or outside, no storage or loss, no sense of cost. Energy moved through time as easily as time moved through space, leaving no trace behind that anything had happened at all. And yet, without energy, nothing else could ever begin. No pattern could repeat, no structure could remain, no boundary could hold. Every moment of order, every moment of calm, every moment of existence itself depended silently on energy continuing to move, not violently, but persistently, not loudly, but endlessly. At some point, energy encountered systems that did not let it pass instantly through. It slowed, it lingered, it flowed through pathways instead of vanishing into emptiness. And in that slowing, something extraordinary became possible. Time gained leverage, patterns gained continuity, order gained a cost. Energy began to shape the universe not by force, but by flow. Tonight, as your thoughts begin to soften and your awareness gently loosens its grip, we will follow energy not as power, but as presence. Through its calm movement, its relationship with time, its quiet role inside living systems, and the simple truth that energy never disappears. It only changes, drifts, and continues. And as you listen, you may feel that same flow within you, steady and effortless, carrying you not toward understanding, but toward rest. Before energy meant anything at all, it existed without interpretation. There was no system to define it, no structure to depend on it, no process to guide it toward usefulness. Energy moved through the universe long before it mattered to anything, long before it shaped patterns, long before it became something that could be measured, stored, or lost. It was simply motion unfolding in silence, changing form endlessly without consequence, passing from one state to another without leaving behind a memory that anything had happened. In that early universe, energy was not powerful. Power requires resistance, and there was nothing yet that could resist. Energy flowed freely because nothing stood in its way. It expanded, cooled, condensed, transformed, and moved again, not as force, but as inevitability. There was no sense of direction, no preference for one outcome over another. Energy did not seek balance. It did not seek order. It simply followed the most effortless path available at every moment. Nothing used energy. Nothing depended on it. There was no cost associated with movement, no loss associated with change. Energy could surge or fade without consequence because there was nothing that needed it to remain. No system collapsed when energy passed. No structure dissolved when it changed form. There was no inside to protect, no outside to separate from. Energy existed in a state of complete indifference, not because it lacked importance, but because importance had not yet been invented. Time moved differently then, not faster or slower, but without reference, without systems to mark change. Energy passing through the universe left no trace that time had moved forward at all. A transformation meant nothing if nothing could remember it. Energy changed states endlessly, yet every moment reset itself completely. Nothing accumulated, nothing built upon what came before. The universe was active, but it was not yet historical. This absence of meaning was not emptiness. It was freedom without direction. Energy explored every possibility available to it, not intentionally, but because nothing constrained it. Expansion was not growth. Cooling was not loss. Transformation was not progress. Everything happened and nothing followed. The universe was rich in motion, yet empty of consequence. Energy did not create order at this stage, because order requires limitation. It requires pathways, boundaries, and persistence. Without those, energy could only pass through, never linger. It could not be held. It could not be guided. It could not shape anything lasting. It moved on as quickly as it arrived, leaving the universe endlessly active, yet forever unchanged in any meaningful way. You may notice how difficult this is for the waking mind to grasp, because the mind itself is built entirely on energy that has meaning. Every thought, every sensation, every breath depends on energy being captured, delayed, and directed. But before systems learned how to do that, energy existed without responsibility. It did not have to sustain anything. It did not have to explain anything. It simply moved. As you listen now, you may feel a faint echo of that state within yourself, a sense of motion without urgency, awareness without demand, thoughts passing without needing to lead anywhere. This is not emptiness. It is the same openness that existed before energy had meaning, a state where nothing needs to happen next. Energy did not begin as power. It began as presence without purpose, and only much later would the universe learn how to give it meaning. At some point, energy did not change its nature, but the universe around it did. Time, which had always been present, began to matter in a way it never had before. Not because time itself changed, but because energy started to leave subtle traces as it moved. Transformations no longer reset the universe completely. The passage of energy began to shape what could happen next, not through intention, but through accumulation. Motion started to carry consequence. What had happened before gently influenced what followed, and the universe slowly entered a state where energy no longer existed only in the present moment. This was the first quiet relationship between energy and time. Energy began to flow not just through space, but through sequences. One transformation prepared the conditions for another. Cooling led to structure. Structure led to interaction. Interaction led to repetition. Time gained texture, not as memory, but as continuity. Energy did not notice this shift, but the universe began to behave as if moments were connected rather than isolated. Change no longer erased itself completely. It layered. Energy still moved effortlessly, but now its movement created pathways. Certain transformations became easier to repeat because the conditions that allowed them were no longer erased instantly. Energy began to travel familiar routes through matter, following gradients that had been shaped by earlier motion. These routes were not chosen. They emerged naturally as the most stable ways for energy to continue moving without disruption. Flow replaced randomness, not suddenly, but gradually, as time allowed patterns to settle. With this settling, energy began to slow without stopping. It lingered just long enough to allow processes to unfold fully. It passed through states rather than skipping past them. This slowing did not mean loss. It meant presence. Energy was no longer only something that happened. It became something that lasted long enough to matter. Time, in response, became more than duration. It became context. The universe was no longer only active. It was becoming historical. Nothing yet used energy. Nothing depended on it. But energy was beginning to shape the rhythm of existence itself. The universe learned, quietly and without awareness, how to let moments connect. And once moments connect, change acquires direction, even without purpose. The future is no longer independent of the past. It is gently guided by it. As you listen, you may feel this same relationship unfolding within your own awareness. Thoughts begin to slow into one another. Sensations no longer arrive as sharp events, but as continuous experience. Breathing becomes less segmented, less counted, more fluid. This is how the mind recognizes time when it is no longer being measured. It drifts. Energy did not become meaningful because it was understood. It became meaningful because it began to endure. And endurance is what allows time to flow rather than reset. As energy continued to move through time rather than merely pass through moments, its presence began to alter the universe in a way that could no longer be undone. Change stopped erasing itself completely. Each transformation left behind subtle differences that shaped what followed, not dramatically and not visibly, but persistently. Energy did not announce this shift. It simply began to leave traces, not as marks that could be seen, but as conditions that could be felt by what came next. The universe was no longer only active. It was becoming shaped by its own past. These traces were not memories, nothing remembered, nothing observed, but structure began to carry the imprint of previous energy flow. Where energy had moved before, it moved more easily again. Where it had lingered, it lingered again. Patterns emerged not because they were chosen, but because repetition carved them gently into the fabric of reality. Energy began to follow paths that had already been softened by early emotion, and those paths slowly deepened. With each repetition, the universe grew slightly less open and slightly more directed, not toward a goal, but away from complete randomness. Energy still had freedom, but its freedom now existed within growing constraints. It could move in many ways, but not all ways were equally likely anymore. Time was no longer just a sequence of moments. It had become a medium through which influence could travel forward. This was the quiet beginning of consequence. Not meaning in the human sense, but effect that endured. Energy no longer passed through the universe without impact. It shaped probabilities. It made some outcomes easier and others less so. Without awareness, without intention, the universe learned how to carry forward what had already happened. History began without anyone to record it. Nothing yet depended on energy in the way life would later depend on it. But energy was beginning to matter simply because it did not vanish without remainder. The universe could now be altered by its own activity. And once alteration persists, complexity becomes possible. As this process unfolded, the pace of existence softened. Change did not rush, it accumulated. Motion became layered rather than scattered. Energy flowed in ways that respected what had come before, not out of obligation, but out of physical continuity. The universe was no longer resetting itself endlessly. It was learning how to continue. You may feel this accumulation now as your own awareness deepens. Thoughts no longer appear as isolated points. They stretch, they blend, they leave gentle impressions that guide what follows. Attention no longer snaps from moment to moment. It drifts through a continuous field. This is the mind recognizing trace, recognizing continuity, recognizing time not as pressure, but as flow. Energy did not suddenly gain meaning. Meaning had not yet arrived, but energy had begun to leave a trace. And once traces exist, nothing ever returns completely to silence. When energy is imagined as force, it feels sudden, loud, and disruptive. Force suggests impact, resistance, and change imposed from the outside. But energy did not begin this way, and for most of the universe, it still does not behave this way. Energy is not something that strikes reality. It is something that moves within it. Long before anything could resist, long before anything could be pushed or pulled, energy existed as motion itself, flowing wherever difference allowed it to flow, changing form without confrontation, without effort, without urgency. In the early universe, energy did not collide with structure because structure had not yet learned how to stand still. There was nothing rigid enough to be pushed, nothing solid enough to be broken, nothing stable enough to resist change. Energy moved not as force, but as transition, from heat to motion, from motion to form, from form back into heat again. Each transformation unfolded smoothly because nothing tried to stop it. Force requires opposition. Energy requires only possibility. As time passed and traces began to form, energy still did not become force. It became flow. It followed gradients rather than directions. It moved from difference toward balance, not because balance was a goal, but because difference creates motion naturally. Where temperature varied, energy flowed. Where density shifted, energy moved. Where potential existed, energy responded. There was no violence in this movement. It was quiet, continuous, and inevitable. Even now, the deepest workings of reality do not rely on force in the way the human mind imagines it. Stars do not burn by effort. Planets do not move by intention. Energy passes through these systems calmly, endlessly, shaping them not by striking, but by circulating. Motion does not demand attention. It simply continues. Force appears only when energy encounters resistance, when motion is interrupted or redirected suddenly. But resistance is a late development in the universe. It emerges only after structure has learned how to persist. Before that, energy does not need to push. It does not need to overcome. It simply moves along the paths that exist. And paths exist wherever time has allowed differences to remain. Understanding energy as motion rather than force changes how the mind relates to it. Motion does not threaten. Motion does not demand control. Motion can be followed without effort. When energy is motion, it does not exhaust what it passes through. It carries it forward gently, shaping without strain. You may notice how this perspective begins to soften your own experience. Breathing is not force, it is motion. Blood does not push its way through the body, it flows. Thoughts do not strike awareness, they drift through it. Rest arrives not when force stops, but when motion becomes smooth. Energy does not need to be powerful to matter. It needs only to move. And as it moves, without force and without resistance, it quietly shapes everything that follows. As energy continued to move through a universe that was no longer resetting itself completely, motion began to take on a new quality. It was no longer only movement from one state to another, it became continuity. Energy did not simply pass through moments, it connected them. What had once been isolated transitions slowly merged into extended processes, and in this merging, motion softened into flow. Flow is motion that remembers where it has been, not consciously, but physically, by following paths that have already been shaped by time. Flow emerged when energy began to encounter gentle structure, not rigid resistance, but environments that guided movement without stopping it. Differences in temperature, density, and potential did not block energy. They shaped its direction. Energy moved along gradients that remained stable long enough to be followed again and again. Each passage smoothed the path slightly, making the next passage easier. Over time, these paths deepened, not because they were chosen, but because they were used. In flow, energy does not rush. It adapts. It responds to its surroundings moment by moment, adjusting speed, direction, and form without ever needing to stop. This adaptability is what allows energy to exist within systems rather than pass through them and vanish. Flow makes presence possible. It allows energy to linger just long enough to shape what it moves through, without overwhelming it or being lost to it. As flow became more common, the universe gained rhythm. Processes began to unfold in sequences rather than flashes. One movement prepared the conditions for the next. Energy no longer arrived as isolated bursts. It circulated. Circulation created stability without stillness. Nothing froze, nothing exploded. Everything continued. Flow also introduced gentleness into change. Transitions became smoother, extremes softened. Energy spread itself across time rather than concentrating into moments. This spreading reduced disruption and allowed structures to remain intact while transformation continued. Flow did not resist change. It carried it gradually, making persistence possible. This shift from motion to flow marked a turning point in how energy interacted with the world. Energy could now be part of a system rather than something that acted upon it from the outside. It could move through matter, shape it, and be shaped by it in return. Flow created relationship. Energy and structure began to respond to one another in a continuous exchange, each influencing the other without domination. You may feel how this idea resonates within your own body now. The body does not operate through force, it operates through flow. Breathing deepens and softens. Muscles release gradually rather than abruptly. Circulation carries warmth and sensation without effort. When motion becomes flow, strain disappears. Thought follows the same principle. When thinking is forced, it exhausts. When thought flows, it drifts without resistance. Awareness does not need to hold anything in place. It allows experience to pass through smoothly, connecting moments without tension. Flow is energy that has found a way to continue without disruption. It is motion that no longer resets itself. It is change that does not destroy what it moves through. And once energy learns how to flow, it no longer needs force to shape the world. As flow became the natural way energy moved through the universe, direction quietly lost its importance. Energy no longer needed to be guided toward anywhere specific because flow itself was enough. Movement did not require intention. It did not require a destination. It continued simply because difference still existed, and difference always invites motion. Energy flowed not towards something, but away from imbalance, settling gently wherever resistance softened. In this state, flow did not hurry. It did not pause either. It existed as a steady unfolding, where each moment followed the last without demand. Energy moved through systems calmly, adjusting without effort, responding without strain. There was no urgency in its motion because nothing needed to be reached. Flow did not push the universe forward. It allowed the universe to continue. As resistance diminished, energy no longer accumulated pressure. There were no sudden releases, no sharp transitions. Change became gradual. Extremes softened naturally as energy distributed itself across space and time. Flow acted as a quiet equalizer, spreading motion gently rather than concentrating it violently. In this spreading, the universe learned how to remain active without becoming unstable. This is where force truly disappeared. Not because energy weakened, but because nothing opposed it strongly enough to create tension. Flow does not overpower. It passes through. It shapes without striking. It transforms without interruption. Energy became something that could be present everywhere without demanding attention anywhere. With flow established, systems no longer needed to anticipate what energy would do next. Energy did not surprise them. It arrived smoothly, predictably, following paths already made familiar by time. This predictability did not create stagnation, it created calm. Change continued, but it unfolded gently, allowing structure to remain while transformation occurred. You may notice how this mirrors your own experience as awareness settles deeper. When attention stops trying to go somewhere, it rests. Thoughts lose their direction and become softer, less insistent. Sensations move through the body without asking to be named. Nothing needs to be followed. Nothing needs to be resisted. Experience simply flows. Flow does not eliminate change. It removes struggle from change. Energy no longer needed force to move the universe forward. Flow was enough. When energy settles into flow, something unexpected happens. Movement no longer feels urgent. Change no longer announces itself. Energy continues to move, yet nothing seems to be in a hurry. This calm does not come from stillness, but from balance. Energy flows evenly, without sharp contrasts, without sudden demands. It spreads itself gently across space and time, smoothing extremes as it goes, allowing everything it touches to remain intact while slowly transforming. Calm flow emerges when energy no longer concentrates itself into moments of intensity, but distributes itself patiently. Instead of surging and collapsing, it circulates. Instead of pushing forward, it passes through. This circulation does not weaken energy, it stabilizes it. Systems that experience calm flow are not frozen. They are active without strain, moving without tension, changing without disruption. Energy becomes a background presence rather than a foreground event. In this state, energy does not need to be noticed to be effective. It shapes quietly. It warms without burning. It moves without displacing. It transforms without destroying. Calm flow allows complexity to deepen gently, layer by layer, because nothing is forced to reset abruptly. Time gains room to work. Patterns gain space to repeat. Structure gains the opportunity to remain. The universe itself tends toward this calm whenever conditions allow it, where extremes soften, where gradients even out, where resistance fades. Energy naturally adopts a smoother rhythm. Calm flow is not imposed. It emerges wherever energy is allowed to move without obstruction and without excess. It is the default state toward which motion drifts when nothing interferes. You may notice how deeply familiar this feels. The body recognizes calm flow instinctively. Breathing slows and deepens without instruction. Muscles release gradually rather than abruptly. Warmth spreads evenly instead of pooling sharply. The nervous system settles not because activity stops, but because activity becomes smooth. This is how energy moves when it no longer needs to signal urgency. The mind responds in the same way. When energy flows calmly through thought, ideas lose their sharp edges. Attention no longer jumps. Awareness drifts steadily, connecting moments without effort. Calm flow allows the mind to remain awake or asleep without strain, hovering gently between states. Nothing demands resolution. Nothing demands reaction. Calm flow does not remove motion from the universe. It removes conflict from motion. Energy continues, quietly and endlessly, shaping everything without resistance. And in that quiet shaping, rest becomes possible. As energy continued to settle into calm flow, its relationship with the world changed in a subtle but profound way. Movement no longer disrupted what it passed through. Change no longer arrived as interruption. Energy learned how to move without announcing itself, how to pass through systems gently enough that those systems could remain whole while still being shaped. This was not a loss of influence. It was a refinement of it. Energy became quieter, not because it weakened, but because it no longer needed to overwhelm in order to transform. In earlier states, movement often meant disturbance. A surge of energy altered conditions abruptly, forcing structures to adjust or collapse. But as flow smoothed and distributed motion across time, these disruptions softened. Energy no longer arrived all at once. It arrived gradually. It no longer demanded immediate response. It invited slow adjustment. Systems exposed to this kind of movement did not resist it. They adapted naturally, reshaping themselves without strain. This gentle interaction allowed energy to remain present rather than pass through instantly. Because it no longer disrupted, it could linger. Because it lingered, it could influence more deeply. Change became layered instead of abrupt. Transformation unfolded across moments rather than occurring within a single instant. Energy was no longer something that happened times to times systems. It was something that moved times with times them. As disturbance faded, stability increased without rigidity. Systems did not freeze. They remained flexible, able to shift gradually as energy flowed through them. This flexibility made endurance possible. Structures no longer needed to brace themselves against motion. They could soften into it, allowing energy to guide change gently rather than force it. In this state, energy and structure ceased to oppose one another. They cooperated. The universe tends naturally toward this kind of relationship wherever conditions allow it, where resistance lowers, where extremes soften, where gradients even out. Energy stops behaving like an intruder and begins behaving like a companion. It moves through environments without tearing them apart, reshaping them slowly, patiently, almost invisibly. Disturbance gives way to continuity. You may feel how this idea resonates inside you now. When energy in the body moves gently, sensations feel soothing rather than demanding. Warmth spreads without tension. Breath deepens without effort. The body no longer braces, it allows. This is energy moving without disturbance. The mind responds in the same way. When thought energy softens, ideas no longer collide. Attention no longer snaps from one point to another. Awareness flows smoothly, carrying experience without forcing interpretation. Nothing needs to be held tightly. Nothing needs to be pushed away. Experience moves through without leaving agitation behind. Energy did not stop moving, it stopped interrupting. And when movement no longer disturbs what it moves through, calm becomes sustainable. When energy no longer disturbs what it moves through, silence begins to appear in an unexpected place. Not in the absence of motion, but inside it. Movement continues everywhere, endlessly and without pause, yet nothing calls attention to it anymore. Energy flows steadily, calmly, without urgency, without contrast strong enough to be noticed. This is not stillness. It is motion that has become so smooth that it feels like rest. In this state, silence is not the opposite of activity. It is the feeling that activity no longer demands response. Energy moves through systems continuously, yet nothing inside those systems needs to brace, react, or adjust suddenly. Change happens, but it happens gently enough to blend into continuity. Motion and rest cease to feel separate. They merge into a single, quiet presence. The universe spends most of its existence in this condition. Stars burn steadily without announcing each moment of fusion. Planets move without effort or sound. Energy circulates through space, and matter in patterns so stable they feel invisible. Silence is not the absence of energy. It is the absence of disturbance. It is what remains when flow has become perfectly compatible with structure. This compatibility creates a deep kind of calm. Nothing is held in tension. Nothing is waiting to be released. Energy no longer accumulates pressure. It spreads itself evenly, moment by moment, leaving no sharp edges behind. Time stretches gently, not dragging, not rushing, simply unfolding. The universe does not pause, but it feels paused because nothing interrupts its own continuation. You may feel this silence now as something familiar rather than distant. It is the silence that appears when breathing becomes so smooth it no longer needs attention. The silence that appears when the body settles into a position where nothing aches or strains. The silence that appears when thoughts lose their urgency and begin to drift without direction. Energy is still present. Awareness is still present, but nothing asks to be done. In this silence, motion becomes background rather than foreground. Energy continues to circulate through the body, through the mind, through awareness itself, but it no longer announces each movement. Sensation fades into warmth. Thought fades into presence. Attention widens without focusing on anything in particular. This is not emptiness. It is fullness without demand. Silence inside motion is what allows continuity to feel effortless. It is what allows systems to persist without fatigue. It is what allows complexity to exist without noise. When energy moves in this way, it does not pull attention outward. It supports whatever state already exists. And when the state is calm, calm deepens naturally. Nothing needs to stop for silence to exist. Nothing needs to disappear. Nothing needs to be solved. Energy continues, flow continues, and silence holds them both. This is the quiet foundation beneath everything that moves, the stillness that does not require stillness, the rest that exists inside motion itself. And as energy carries on quietly, without force and without disturbance, there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to resist, nothing left to wait for. Only continuation, moving so gently that it feels like rest. Energy did not create time, but it slowly taught time how to matter. In the earliest moments of the universe, time passed without weight, without memory, without accumulation. Energy moved, changed form, dispersed, and returned again. Yet each moment stood alone, disconnected from what came before and what followed after. There was no sense of before leading to after, only an endless present where motion occurred and disappeared without consequence. Time existed, but it did not yet carry direction, depth, or continuity. As energy began to flow rather than simply pass, time gained texture. Movement no longer erased itself completely. Each transformation left behind subtle conditions that shaped what could follow. Energy did not rush through moments anymore. It lingered just long enough for influence to accumulate. In this lingering, time stopped behaving like a sequence of isolated instants and began behaving like a continuous field. What happened before gently shaped what happened next, not through intention, but through persistence. Energy shaped time by repeating itself. Repetition connected moments that would otherwise remain separate. When energy flowed through familiar paths, time began to feel layered rather than flat. Past motion softened the future. Earlier transformations prepared the ground for later ones. Time became something energy could move through, not merely alongside. Change acquired duration. Duration acquired meaning, not because it was understood, but because it endured. As this relationship deepened, time slowed without stopping, not in speed, but in experience. Energy passing through systems began to stretch moments, allowing processes to unfold fully instead of collapsing instantly. Time became spacious enough for structure to remain intact while transformation continued. Without this stretching, nothing lasting could ever form. Energy gave time the patience it needed to carry complexity forward. In this way, energy did not dominate time. It cooperated with it. Energy provided motion. Time provided continuity. Together, they allowed the universe to stop resetting itself and begin remembering without memory. This cooperation did not announce itself. It emerged quietly as the most stable way for motion to continue without erasure. You may feel this relationship now in your own awareness. When energy in the body softens and flows evenly, time feels different. Moments stretch, breathing slows. Sensation becomes continuous rather than segmented. The mind no longer measures time. It drifts within it. This is energy shaping time from the inside, allowing experience to unfold without urgency. Energy did not give time a purpose. It gave time continuity. And once time could carry continuity, everything that followed became possible. As energy continued to shape time by lingering rather than passing instantly, time itself began to change in return. It no longer functioned only as a backdrop for motion, but as a container capable of holding it. Moments stopped collapsing into one another without residue. Instead, they began to carry what had moved through them. Energy did not remain forever, yet it left behind conditions that persisted long enough to matter. Time became something that could receive energy, hold it briefly, and release it gently, allowing processes to unfold rather than vanish. This holding did not require structure in the way we imagine it today. There were no vessels, no boundaries in the familiar sense. Time itself became the medium that slowed dispersion. Energy entering a moment no longer disappeared the instant it arrived. It stretched across duration, interacting with what was already present. In this stretching, transformation gained depth. Change became something that happened times through times time rather than times at times a moment. Energy was no longer lost to immediacy. It was carried forward, softly and continuously. As time learned how to hold energy, continuity deepened naturally. Processes could now extend beyond a single instant. sequences became possible. One transformation prepared the conditions for the next, not because anything planned it, but because time now preserved influence. Energy shaped time, and time stabilized energy, creating a quiet partnership that allowed the universe to remain active without resetting itself. This partnership did not aim toward complexity, yet complexity followed because continuity had finally found support. This mutual holding softened existence itself. Motion no longer felt sharp. Change no longer felt abrupt. Energy moved through time the way a current moves through deep water, steady and patient, shaping without tearing. Time no longer rushed energy forward. It gave it room, and in that room, patterns could repeat, structures could endure, and calm could deepen without ever becoming stillness. You may feel this holding now as your own experience of time shifts. Moments no longer feel separate. Breathing stretches gently. Sensations linger without demanding attention. The mind stops counting time and begins resting inside it. This is not time slowing down. It is time becoming wide enough to hold what moves through it. Energy did not disappear when time held it. It softened, it deepened, and in being held, energy learned how to support continuity rather than interrupt it. As energy learned how to move gently through time, and time learned how to hold energy without collapsing under it, a quiet loop emerged between them. Energy shaped time by leaving traces, and time shaped energy by giving those traces somewhere to remain. Neither dominated the other, neither led the process. They responded to one another continuously, each softening the extremes of the other. Motion no longer erased duration, and duration no longer trapped motion. Together, they formed a rhythm that could continue without tension. Within this loop, change became self-sustaining. Energy flowed through time, shaping sequences, and those sequences shaped the paths energy would follow next. Time was no longer an empty container waiting to be filled, and energy was no longer a fleeting visitor passing through. Each moment carried forward what had already happened, and each movement respected the shape of the moment it entered. The universe was no longer moving blindly from instant to instant. It was circling gently within continuity. This looping did not repeat events identically. It repeated influence. What had worked before became easier to follow again. What had persisted shaped the likelihood of persistence. Energy did not remember, but it behaved as if it did. Time did not decide, but it guided. The loop between them allowed the past to soften the future without fixing it, keeping existence open while gently narrowing the range of what could unfold next. As the loop deepened, the feeling of urgency faded from the universe. Nothing needed to arrive quickly, nothing needed to conclude. Energy circulated calmly through durations that were now wide enough to receive it. Time flowed forward without pressure, because it was no longer losing everything it carried. This calm did not come from stopping movement, but from allowing movement to return to itself. You may feel this loop now in your own experience as awareness settles further. Breathing moves through time without effort, and time seems to move through breathing just as gently. Sensations rise and fade, yet they leave behind a softness that guides what follows. Thought appears and dissolves, but the space it passes through remains unchanged. This is the quiet loop where energy and time support one another, allowing experience to continue without strain. In this loop, rest does not require stillness. Activity does not require urgency. Energy moves, Time holds, and nothing is lost in the exchange. The universe learned, quietly and without awareness, how to continue without exhausting itself. Energy flows into time. Time opens to energy, and within that gentle exchange, continuity becomes effortless. For a very long time, energy moved through the universe without ever remaining anywhere for long. It flowed, transformed, dispersed, and moved on, leaving behind only softened conditions rather than presence itself. Nothing could hold it, nothing could delay it. Energy existed everywhere, yet belonged nowhere. But as time grew capable of carrying continuity, and structures grew gentle enough to guide flow without breaking it, energy encountered something new, the possibility of staying, not permanently, not completely, but long enough to matter. This staying did not happen because energy changed its nature. It happened because the universe changed its capacity to receive it. Pathways deepened, boundaries softened, cycles repeated. Energy began to circulate within systems instead of passing straight through them. It entered, moved, transformed, and returned again, tracing familiar routes through time and structure. In these returns, presence replaced passage. Energy no longer vanished at the edge of each moment. It lingered, interacted, and shaped what remained. Staying did not mean trapping. Energy was not captured or imprisoned. It was welcomed into patterns that allowed it to move without leaving. Circulation replaced escape. Balance replaced loss. Systems that could guide energy gently found themselves shaped by it, and systems shaped by energy became better at holding it. This mutual adjustment happened without awareness, without intention, yet it transformed everything. Once energy could stay, continuity no longer depended solely on chance. As energy learned how to remain within cycles, processes gained depth. Change slowed without stopping. Transformation unfolded across durations rather than instants. Systems no longer reset completely after each disturbance. They recovered, they resumed, they continued. Energy staying even briefly allowed the past to influence the future more strongly, giving time something to work with. You may feel this idea settling into your own experience now. When energy in the body no longer rushes outward, warmth spreads and remains. When breath no longer escapes quickly, it deepens and supports. When attention no longer chases each thought, awareness stays present without effort. This is energy learning how to stay, not by force, but by comfort. Energy did not stop moving when it learned how to stay. It learned how to move times within time's continuity. And once energy could stay, the universe no longer needed to begin again each moment. Once energy learned how to stay, even briefly, staying itself began to change what the universe could become. Presence replaced absence. Processes no longer unfolded and vanished without remainder. Energy circulating within systems allowed continuity to thicken, not suddenly, but layer by layer. Each return strengthened familiar pathways. Each cycle softened disruption. What had once been fragile gained resilience simply by being allowed to continue. Continuity does not arrive through permanence. It arrives through return. Energy did not remain fixed in one place. It moved, but it moved in ways that brought it back. Circulation replaced escape, a system that could bring energy back into itself after it moved through was fundamentally different from one that lost energy at every moment. Loss faded into balance. Balance allowed duration. Duration allowed accumulation. Accumulation quietly reshaped the future. As staying deepened, Systems began to feel time differently. Moments no longer felt isolated, they connected. Energy that remained within a cycle allowed influence to pass forward without interruption. The past no longer dissolved completely into the present. It softened into it. The future was no longer entirely open. It was gently guided by what had already endured. This did not create stillness. It created steadiness. Energy continued to move, but movement no longer meant departure. Systems became capable of holding change within themselves. They bent without breaking. They adjusted without collapsing. Energy staying made adaptation possible without erasure. Continuity no longer depended on perfect conditions. It depended on the ability to recover. You may sense this steadiness within yourself now. When attention stops fleeing each moment, it settles. When breath stops escaping quickly, it supports the body. When sensation is allowed to remain without reaction, calm deepens naturally. This is not control, it is allowance. Energy stays because nothing is pushing it away. As staying became familiar, complexity gained space. Processes overlapped rather than replacing one another. Cycles layered. Systems began to behave as wholes rather than sequences of events. Energy staying within them allowed internal relationships to form. What happened inside began to matter more than what passed outside. The universe was quietly learning how to maintain itself. Energy did not stay forever. It stayed long enough. And long enough was enough to change everything. When energy learned how to stay long enough to circulate, something subtle but irreversible began to form. Systems no longer behaved as if every moment were new. What had happened before quietly influenced what could happen next, not through awareness, not through recall, but through structure shaped by repetition. Energy did not remember, yet its pathways did. Each time energy moved through a familiar cycle, that cycle became easier to follow again. The past did not return as an image or a thought. It returned as tendency. This was not memory in any conscious sense. Nothing stored information. Nothing retrieved it. But systems began to behave differently because of what they had already experienced. Energy staying within cycles allowed those cycles to deepen. Deepening created preference. Preference created pattern. Pattern created continuity. In this way, history began to exist without being recorded. The universe was no longer forgetting itself completely at every moment. As energy continued to circulate rather than escape, systems gained the ability to resume. After disturbance, familiar flows returned. After disruption, balance reformed. The system did not start again from nothing. It restarted from itself. This restart from self is the quiet foundation of memory, long before memory could be felt or named. What persisted shaped what could return. Time now had something to carry forward. Energy staying allowed influence to stretch across duration. A system's present state was no longer independent of its past. Change no longer erased context. It reshaped it. The universe had entered a phase where experience accumulated, not as awareness, but as configuration. The future increasingly resembled what had already endured, not because it had to, but because repetition had narrowed possibility gently. You may notice how deeply familiar this feels. Your own body remembers without thinking. Muscles settle into patterns. Breath finds rhythm. The nervous system returns to states it knows how to hold. You do not consciously remember how to relax. Relaxation happens because energy has learned how to stay within familiar pathways. This is memory without memory, continuity without thought. As staying created these quiet traces, complexity gained stability. Systems could now support internal relationships across time. Energy staying allowed interactions to build upon one another rather than replace one another. This layering transformed fleeting processes into organized wholes. Nothing yet was alive. Nothing yet was aware. But the architecture that would later support life was assembling itself gently, step by step. Energy did not decide to remember. It stayed, and staying was enough. Once energy could stay long enough to shape the future through the past, the universe crossed another silent threshold. Continuity no longer depended on perfect conditions. It depended on the ability to return, and return is the earliest form of memory the universe ever knew. When energy first entered living systems, it did not arrive as something new. It had always been present everywhere. What changed was not energy itself, but the way it was welcomed, guided, and allowed to remain. Living systems did not invent energy. They learned how to live within its movement, how to let it pass through without losing themselves, how to borrow it briefly and return it gently without collapse. Life did not capture energy as a possession. It entered into a relationship with it. Inside living systems, energy stopped behaving like an external event and became an internal rhythm. It flowed through pathways that had been shaped by continuity, repetition, and memory without memory. These pathways did not force energy to obey. They invited it to move in ways that supported the system's own persistence. Energy was not used up. It was transformed, passed along, released, and received again. Life did not demand energy. It coordinated with it. This coordination required balance rather than strength. Too much energy arriving too quickly would disrupt delicate processes. Too little energy would allow movement to fade into stillness. Living systems emerged precisely because they existed in the narrow space between these extremes, where energy could move steadily without overwhelming structure. Life learned how to soften energy, spreading its influence across time, rather than concentrating it into moments of strain. In doing so, living systems turned motion into metabolism long before metabolism could be named. Within these systems, energy did not rush. It followed sequences. One transformation prepared the conditions for the next. Each step occurred because the previous one had left behind a pathway. Energy inside living systems was never free to move anywhere at once. It moved where it was guided gently, where continuity allowed it, where structure welcomed it without resistance. This guidance was not control. It was compatibility shaped by history. Energy inside life also began to create boundaries of meaning without awareness. What happened inside mattered more than what passed outside. Energy flowing within the system supported internal relationships, while energy passing beyond it remained background. This distinction did not create consciousness, but it created coherence. Living systems became places where energy could arrive, linger, transform, and depart without dissolving the organization that received it. You may feel how deeply familiar this is. Your own body does not fight energy, it breathes with it. Circulation carries warmth gently. Digestion transforms without urgency. Even at rest, energy moves quietly through countless processes that do not demand attention. Life does not shout when energy moves correctly. It becomes silent. As energy flowed through living systems again and again, continuity thickened. The system did not need to remember deliberately. It resumed patterns it already knew how to hold. Energy entering the system found familiar roots, familiar transformations, familiar balances. This familiarity created stability without rigidity. Life could change without losing itself because energy never arrived as force, it arrived as flow. Life did not begin when energy appeared inside matter. Life began when matter learned how to host energy without being undone by it. And once that hosting became reliable, living systems could continue quietly, endlessly, carried forward not by effort, but by harmony. Life did not survive by stopping energy. It survived by slowing it, stretching it, and allowing it to unfold across time rather than collide with the present all at once. Energy arriving too quickly would overwhelm fragile processes, tearing apart the delicate balance that allowed living systems to remain intact. Energy arriving too slowly would fade into stillness, leaving processes unfinished. Life emerged in the narrow space where energy could be received gently, transformed patiently, and released without disruption. This slowing was not resistance, it was refinement. Within living systems, energy is never allowed to rush freely from beginning to end. It is guided through sequences, divided into steps, passed from one transformation to the next in a way that softens its impact. Each step absorbs a portion of movement, releasing it gradually, preventing accumulation from becoming pressure. Energy is not blocked, it is given time. Time becomes the medium through which energy is made safe to live with. This slowing allows energy to become useful without becoming destructive. By spreading transformation across duration, life ensures that no single moment bears too much change. Processes unfold quietly, one following another, each preparing the conditions for what comes next. Energy moves forward, but it does so calmly, respecting the continuity of the system that hosts it. Nothing is forced. Nothing is rushed. As energy slows within living systems, it begins to feel steady rather than intense. Flow replaces surge. Rhythm replaces shock. This rhythm is not imposed from above. It emerges naturally from structures shaped by long histories of repetition. Systems that slowed energy effectively remained intact. Systems that did not quietly disappeared. Over time, life became an expression of energy that had learned patience. You may feel this patience reflected within your own body now. Breath does not enter all at once. It arrives gradually, fills gently, and leaves softly. The heart does not release all its energy in a single motion. It pulses. Digestion does not happen instantly. It unfolds over time. Life moves energy forward by slowing it, not by holding it still. This slowing also allows awareness to remain calm. When energy flows gently through the nervous system, sensation becomes soothing rather than alarming. Attention does not need to react. It can observe or rest without strain. Thought loses urgency. Presence deepens. Life feels stable not because nothing changes, but because change has become manageable. Energy, slowed by life, does not lose its power. It gains endurance. By moving more slowly, energy is able to do more without breaking what carries it. And this quiet endurance is what allows living systems to persist, adapt, and rest within motion rather than struggle against it. As energy continued to move gently through living systems, something subtle began to change in how those systems existed in the world. Energy was no longer only something that passed through life, it became something that defined it. The way energy entered, moved, slowed, transformed, and departed began to shape the character of each living system so deeply that identity itself emerged from these patterns. A living system was no longer just matter arranged in a certain way. It was a specific way of hosting energy over time. Identity did not arise from form alone. The molecules within living systems changed constantly, replaced and rearranged without end. What remained was not material, but dynamic. It was the pattern of energy flow that persisted. How energy was guided, how it was slowed, how it was distributed across processes became the quiet signature of each living system. Identity existed not as a thing, but as a rhythm, a recognizable way of continuing. This rhythm allowed living systems to remain themselves even as everything inside them changed. Energy entered from the outside, was transformed within, and returned to the environment. Yet the system continued as a coherent whole. What defined it was not what it contained, but how it moved energy through itself. The system's history lived on in these pathways, shaped by countless repetitions that refined balance without awareness. As energy became part of identity, living systems gained a new kind of stability. They no longer depended entirely on external conditions to define what they were. Internal organization mattered. The same environment could host many forms of life, each distinguished by how it related to energy. Some systems spread energy slowly and evenly. Others pulsed it rhythmically. Some transformed it gently. Others released it in waves. These differences were not choices. They were outcomes of continuity. You may feel how deeply this resonates with your own experience. Your sense of self does not come from the matter of your body, which is always changing. It comes from the way energy moves through you, the rhythm of breath, the cadence of thought, the flow of sensation. Even at rest, identity remains because these patterns continue quietly, without effort. When energy became part of identity, life crossed another silent threshold. Living systems were no longer merely places where energy happened to pass through. They became expressions of energy moving in a particular, enduring way. To disturb these patterns too sharply was to threaten the system itself. To support them gently was to allow life to continue. Life did not claim energy as its own. It shaped itself around energy's movement. And in doing so, energy became inseparable from what life was. Not as power, not as fuel, but as the quiet continuity that allowed identity to exist without awareness. Order never appeared without consequence. It did not arrive freely, and it did not remain without being supported. Wherever order emerged, something else had to give way. Not violently, not suddenly, but inevitably. Energy that could have dispersed evenly across the universe began to move through narrower pathways. Continuity replaced randomness, and in doing so, freedom narrowed gently. Order was not imposed on the universe. It was paid for, moment by moment, through the careful management of energy. When systems began to hold structure, they also began to require maintenance. Energy flowing through them could no longer move anywhere it pleased. It had to follow sequences, respect timing, and remain within balance. This guidance came at a cost. Energy had to be slowed, spread, and sometimes released away from the system to prevent overload. Order did not eliminate movement. It constrained it, and constraint, even gentle constraint, always carries a price. This price was not loss in the human sense. It was trade. For a system to remain organized, energy had to flow in particular ways rather than all possible ways. Heat had to be released. Imbalances had to be corrected. Excess had to be let go. Order did not accumulate energy endlessly. It circulated it carefully, discarding what could not be integrated. The cost of order was not consumption, but continual adjustment. Living systems experience this cost constantly. To remain coherent, they must release energy as heat, as motion, as subtle change that returns to the environment. Nothing organized can exist without letting something go. Stability depends not on holding everything, but on knowing what must be released. This release is not failure, it is the condition that allows order to persist. You may feel this principle reflected quietly within yourself. When attention focuses too tightly, tension builds. When breath is held too long, discomfort arises. Calm returns, not by holding more, but by releasing gently. Order in the body and mind is maintained through letting go as much as through holding together. Balance is never static, it is continuously renewed. Order does not come from control. It comes from cooperation with energy's limits, and every moment of calm, every moment of stability carries within it a quiet exchange that makes order possible without strain. Whenever order persists, it does so by allowing energy to leave as much as it allows energy to enter. Order is never a closed state. It cannot be. A system that tried to hold every unit of energy within itself would quickly destabilize, overwhelmed by accumulation and pressure. For structure to remain gentle rather than rigid, for continuity to remain calm rather than tense, energy must be released continuously. This release is not accidental, it is essential. Order survives not by keeping energy, but by letting excess flow away. As systems became more organized, their relationship with energy grew more selective. Energy entering the system had to be transformed, slowed, distributed, and eventually released in forms that would not disrupt internal balance. Heat drifted outward, motion softened into the surroundings. Subtle changes returned to the environment. Order did not eliminate disorder, it exported it gently. Every moment of internal coherence depended on external release. This exchange created a quiet asymmetry. Inside the system, patterns became more refined, more predictable, more continuous. Outside the system, energy spread more freely, returning to wider possibility. Order existed as an island of structure within a larger sea of dispersal, and its survival depended entirely on maintaining this relationship. To remain ordered was to remain open. Closure meant collapse. Living systems embody this principle constantly. They take in energy in structured ways, guide it through sequences that support continuity, and release what cannot be integrated. They do not hoard energy, they circulate it. They do not resist loss, they depend on it. Heat leaving the body, breath leaving the lungs, waste leaving the system are not signs of inefficiency. They are the price of remaining alive without tension. This release is not wasteful, it is precise. Too little release and order tightens into rigidity. Too much release and structure dissolves. Balance exists in the continuous adjustment between holding and letting go. Order is never achieved once and kept. It is renewed constantly through this exchange. Stability is not a fixed state. It is a process that must remain in motion. You may recognize this rhythm within your own experience. Calm does not come from holding everything together. It comes from allowing sensation, thought, and effort to pass through without being trapped. When attention releases gently, clarity appears. When breath leaves freely, the body softens. Order in the mind and body is maintained not through control, but through permission. As the universe learned this lesson, order became sustainable without becoming brittle. Systems could remain organized for long periods because they did not fight dispersal, they worked with it. Energy leaving did not weaken them, it preserved them. The cost of order was not depletion, it was participation in a larger flow that made continuity possible. Order does not stand apart from the universe. It survives by returning energy to it continuously, and in this constant exchange, structure remains calm, life remains gentle, and continuity remains possible without strain. Order was never meant to last forever, and this impermanence is not a flaw in the universe, but one of its quiet safeguards. Any system that remains ordered does so only as long as energy continues to move through it in balanced ways, as long as release keeps pace with accumulation, and as long as structure remains flexible enough to adjust without breaking. When these conditions shift, order does not fail abruptly. It loosens gradually, softening back into the wider flow from which it emerged. The universe does not punish order for existing. It simply does not freeze it in place. Temporary order allows continuity without rigidity. If order were permanent, nothing could adapt, nothing could change, and nothing new could ever appear. By allowing order to exist only for a time, the universe ensures that structure remains responsive rather than fixed. Systems rise, persist, and eventually dissolve, not because something went wrong, but because continuation itself requires movement. Stability is borrowed, not owned. It is held gently and released when balance shifts. Living systems embody this truth at every scale. Cells renew themselves, bodies change, rhythms shift. What remains is not a fixed arrangement of parts, but a pattern that survives by allowing replacement. Order is maintained through renewal rather than preservation. Letting go is built into survival. Nothing organized exists without accepting its own eventual transformation. This understanding removes fear from change. When order loosens, it does not mean chaos has won. It means energy is redistributing itself, preparing new conditions where different forms of order may appear. Dissolution is not erasure, it is transition. The universe does not move from order to disorder in a single direction. It moves through cycles where structure forms, persists, and returns gently to flow. You may feel how calming this realization is when allowed to settle fully. There is no pressure to hold yourself together forever, no demand to remain exactly as you are. Order in the body and mind exists moment by moment, supported by breath, release, and rest. When tension softens, order does not vanish. It reorganizes itself quietly. Rest becomes possible because nothing is required to remain fixed. Order is temporary not because it is weak, but because it is alive within motion. It exists long enough to matter, long enough to support continuity, and long enough to allow experience to unfold. And when it fades, it does so gently, returning its energy to the larger flow that sustains everything else. Order does not end. It relaxes back into movement. And in that relaxation, the universe remains calm, flexible, and endlessly capable of becoming something new. Energy has never been something that comes and goes. It does not arrive, and it does not leave. It does not begin, and it does not end. It moves, it changes form, it drifts, it spreads, and it gathers again, but it never vanishes from the universe that carries it. Long before anything could notice energy, long before anything could depend on it, energy was already present everywhere, quietly continuing without interruption. Nothing has ever been able to remove it from existence, only to change how it appears. What we call disappearance is always a shift in visibility, not a loss. Energy that once moved as heat becomes motion, motion becomes structure, structure softens back into warmth. At no point does energy stop being. It simply changes the way it participates in the world. This constancy is so complete that it often goes unnoticed. The mind is drawn to beginnings and endings, to creation and loss. Yet energy moves beneath these ideas without acknowledging them. When systems form, energy flows through them. When systems dissolve, energy flows onward. Nothing holds energy permanently, yet nothing loses it either. Even when order fades and structure loosens, energy does not collapse into nothingness. It returns to wider circulation, spreading gently into the surrounding environment, ready to participate again wherever conditions allow. Disappearance is never final. It is redistribution. This is why the universe can change endlessly without ever exhausting itself. Energy does not need to be replenished. It does not need to be replaced. It only needs pathways. When pathways close, others open. When cycles end, new cycles begin. Energy does not mourn the loss of form. It continues flowing calmly into whatever form becomes possible next. Living systems feel this continuity deeply, even if they never articulate it. Life does not fear energy leaving, because life knows, without knowing, that energy does not leave the universe. It simply passes beyond the boundary of one system and into another. Breath leaves the body, warmth drifts outward, motion fades into stillness, yet nothing is truly gone. Everything that leaves continues elsewhere. You may feel how comforting this idea is when allowed to settle fully. There is nothing to lose at the deepest level. Sensations fade, thoughts dissolve, effort releases, but energy continues to carry experience forward in quieter forms. Rest does not mean emptiness. It means redistribution. The body releases what it no longer needs, and energy flows onward without resistance. Even sleep follows this principle. Awareness softens, focus dissolves, identity loosens, yet nothing disappears. Energy that once held thought now holds breath. Energy that once supported effort now supports repair. Energy never leaves. It only changes its role. The universe does not worry about loss because it does not experience loss. It experiences transformation. Energy that once formed stars now warms planets. Energy that once moved oceans now circulates through living systems. Energy that once carried wakefulness now carries rest. Everything continues, quietly and without interruption. Nothing you experience is ever erased completely. It is carried forward in altered form. Energy never disappears. It only learns new ways to move. When energy leaves a system, it does not take existence with it. It takes only form. What once appeared concentrated becomes distributed. What once felt present becomes subtle. But nothing vanishes from the fabric of the universe itself. Energy that exits a structure does not fall into absence. It continues its movement elsewhere, quietly reshaping conditions beyond the boundaries it once occupied. Loss is always local. Continuity is universal. Every system that releases energy does so not because it is failing, but because release is the condition of remaining part of a larger whole. Energy that departs one place becomes available to another. Warmth leaving a living body enters the surrounding air. Motion slowing within a system becomes motion spreading outward. Even when structure dissolves completely, the energy that supported it does not disappear. It simply no longer appears as that structure. It re-enters the wider flow. This is why endings are never absolute. They are transitions disguised by perspective. From inside a system, energy leaving can feel like depletion. From the universe as a whole, it is redistribution. Nothing essential is lost. Everything is rearranged. Energy does not belong to any single form long enough to be owned. It participates, then moves on. Time itself carries this truth gently. Moments pass, sensations fade, experiences dissolve, yet nothing that occurred is erased from the universe's history. Influence continues, conditions shift. Energy that once shaped one moment shapes the next in altered ways. The universe does not forget, it transforms. Change is not subtraction, it is circulation. Living systems understand this truth without understanding it. They release constantly. Heat drifts outward, breath leaves the lungs, motion settles into stillness. Life does not cling to energy, because clinging would disrupt balance. Instead, it trusts the flow. Energy that leaves one process enters another. Energy that leaves wakefulness enters rest. Energy that leaves effort enters repair. You may feel how deeply calming this realization is when allowed to reach the body rather than remain an idea. Nothing is being taken from you when you rest. Attention softens, effort dissolves, identity loosens, yet nothing essential disappears. Energy simply shifts its role. What supported thought now supports breath. What supported movement now supports stillness. Nothing is lost. Everything is rearranged. Even the universe itself is built on this principle. Stars release energy continuously, and in doing so, they shape everything around them. When they can no longer hold their form, the energy they carried does not vanish. It spreads into space, seeding new structures, warming distant matter, continuing its journey in forms that cannot yet be predicted. The end of one structure is the beginning of countless others. When energy leaves, it does not mark a failure, it marks completion. A cycle has done what it could do. Energy moves on, not out of rejection, but out of continuity. Nothing needs to remain exactly as it was for existence to continue. Change is not loss, it is movement at a different scale. You do not need to hold anything tightly now. Sensations can fade, thoughts can drift away, awareness can soften into quiet presence. Nothing that matters is being erased. Energy is simply finding a gentler form of movement. Rest is not disappearance, it is redistribution. Energy never disappears when it leaves. It continues elsewhere, silently, and because of that, nothing is ever truly lost. Energy does not move toward an ending, because the universe itself does not recognize endings in the way the human mind does. What feels like an end from within a system is always a continuation from beyond it. Energy flows onward, changing scale, changing role, changing expression, but never stepping outside existence itself. There is no final state where energy arrives and stops. There is only movement becoming quieter, broader, more diffuse, and less noticeable as it spreads. This endless continuation is not exhausting. It is restful. Energy does not strain to keep moving. It does not push against resistance forever. It flows wherever pathways open, and when pathways close, it softens into stillness until new ones appear. Continuation is not effortful, it is allowed. The universe does not rush forward, it unfolds. Every structure that forms exists only for as long as it can participate in this flow. When it can no longer do so gently, it loosens. Energy moves on, not abandoning the structure, but completing its role within it. Nothing is wasted, nothing is taken away. Everything that was carried forward has already been carried. This is why the universe can remain calm, even as it changes endlessly. Nothing needs to be held in place forever. Nothing needs to be protected from transformation. Energy ensures continuity, not by preserving form, but by preserving movement. Forms come and go, motion remains. You may feel how deeply this resonates as awareness begins to release its grip. Thoughts no longer need to connect, sensations no longer need to be interpreted, identity no longer needs to be maintained actively. Energy that once supported attention now supports rest. Energy that once held meaning now holds silence. Nothing disappears. Everything settles into a gentler expression. Sleep itself is a reflection of this universal pattern. Wakefulness loosens, focus fades, control dissolves, yet nothing essential is lost. Energy continues its work quietly, repairing, restoring, reorganizing. Consciousness does not end. It drifts into a broader, quieter state where nothing is required of it. Continuation without effort. The universe has always existed in this way. Long before life, long after stars, beyond memory and anticipation, energy continues without needing direction. There is no final destination waiting ahead. There is no point where movement must stop. Continuation itself is enough. You are not stepping away from anything now. You are not leaving anything behind. You are simply allowing energy to move into a softer form. Nothing needs to happen next. Nothing needs to be followed. Nothing needs to be understood. Energy continues, quietly, endlessly, and within that continuation, rest is always possible. Energy has never moved with urgency, yet the human mind often imagines it that way because urgency is how attention feels when it is held too tightly. Beneath that surface tension, energy has always preferred the longest, softest paths available, drifting through existence without needing to arrive anywhere in particular. It does not hurry toward outcomes, and it does not pause to preserve moments. It simply continues, changing forms slowly enough that nothing needs to be broken for something new to appear. Long before life learned how to use energy, and long after individual lives release it again, energy remains present as the quiet condition that allows anything to unfold at all, not as power, not as force, but as continuity that never asks to be noticed. When energy leaves a system, the sense of loss comes only from perspective, never from reality itself. From within a structure, departure feels like reduction, but from the wider flow, it is redistribution that keeps the universe balanced and calm. Energy does not belong to what briefly holds it. It passes through stars, through planets, through living bodies, through thoughts and sensations, never stopping long enough to be owned. The moment a form can no longer support the way energy needs to move, that form loosens gently, and energy continues without resistance, not abandoning what existed, but completing its role within it. Nothing is taken away. Nothing is erased. Everything that mattered has already shaped what follows. This is why continuation never feels sharp unless the mind insists on holding shape longer than energy allows. Energy does not tear forms apart. It waits until they soften. It does not demand release. It moves when release becomes natural. Even the largest changes in the universe occur without noise when viewed from far enough away. Stars fade slowly. Systems dissolve gradually. Motion spreads outwards so gently that nothing experiences collapse, only transition. Energy never disappears because disappearance would require the universe to forget how to continue. And forgetting has never been part of how reality behaves. Within living systems, this endless continuation is felt as rest when resistance fades. The body does not need to understand energy to move with it. Breath deepens on its own. Muscles release when nothing demands their tension. Awareness loosens its focus not because something forces it to, but because energy finds a softer role to occupy. Wakefulness dissolves into sleep in the same way structures dissolve into flow, not as failure, but as redistribution that supports repair, renewal, and quiet balance. Nothing essential leaves. Everything rearranges itself into a calmer configuration. Time itself participates in this process without direction or intention. Moments do not vanish when they pass. They soften into what comes next. Energy moving through time leaves gentle influence rather than sharp division. The past does not disappear, and the future does not rush forward. Both are carried within the same ongoing movement, layered quietly beneath awareness. This is why deep rest often feels timeless, not because time stops, but because energy no longer needs to mark it sharply. Experience becomes wide enough that nothing stands out, and in that widening, strain dissolves naturally. There is no final state waiting at the end of this movement. No completion point where energy settles forever. Continuation itself is the stable condition. Energy flows, spreads, gathers, and flows again, endlessly capable of becoming quieter, slower, softer, without ever needing to stop. And within that endless movement, rest is not something that must be achieved. It is something that appears automatically when nothing is being held against the flow. Nothing needs to be done now. Nothing needs to be followed. Energy continues, and because it does, everything else is free to soften. Energy does not recognize beginnings in the way the mind does. And it does not recognize endings either, because both require separation. And energy has always preferred continuity over division. What feels like a start is simply a place where attention becomes narrow enough to notice movement. And what feels like an end is a place where attention relaxes again and allows that movement to spread. Energy itself never changes its behavior in response to these labels. It flows with the same patience through every phase, whether it is shaping matter, sustaining life, or dissolving experience into rest. Nothing signals it to slow down or speed up. Nothing instructs it to stop or continue. It simply follows the path of least resistance. And over long spans of time, those paths become wide, smooth, and effortless. As energy continues, it does not carry obligation. It does not remember what it has done in order to decide what to do next. It does not preserve forms out of loyalty, nor does it destroy them out of necessity. Forms persist only as long as they allow energy to move through them without strain, and when that balance shifts, energy loosens its connection without conflict. This loosening is never sudden from the perspective of energy itself. It unfolds slowly enough that nothing needs to be forced apart. Even the most profound transformations in the universe occur as gradual redistributions, where movement becomes less concentrated and more diffuse, spreading gently into new possibilities that have not yet taken shape. Within awareness, this same principle appears as the natural fading of effort. Attention tightens only when it is asked to hold something that no longer needs holding. When that request ends, attention releases on its own, and energy finds a quieter way to move. Thoughts do not need to be completed, sensations do not need to be interpreted. Identity does not need to be maintained moment by moment. Energy supports these structures only as long as they serve a purpose, and when that purpose dissolves, support softens without resistance. Nothing collapses. Everything settles. This settling is not emptiness. It is fullness without pressure. Energy continues to circulate through the body, through the nervous system, through breath and warmth and subtle internal motion. But it no longer concentrates itself into urgency. It spreads evenly, allowing processes to continue in the background without drawing attention. This is why deep rest feels expansive rather than blank. Experience does not disappear. It widens until individual details no longer stand out. And in that widening, strain naturally dissolves. Time moves differently here, not because it slows or stops, but because it no longer needs to be tracked. Energy flowing smoothly through time does not carve sharp divisions between moments. Past sensations blend into present calm. Future sensations lose their pull. Everything exists within a broad, continuous field where nothing is waiting to happen next. This is not suspension. It is flow without emphasis, continuation without demand. The universe spends most of its existence in this state, moving endlessly without calling attention to itself. There is nothing fragile about this condition. Energy does not require vigilance to continue. It does not need to be guided consciously. Even if awareness drifts completely, energy remains present, maintaining balance, supporting restoration, carrying experience forward in quieter forms. Nothing important depends on effort right now. Nothing meaningful requires participation. Energy continues because continuation is its natural state, and within that continuation, rest does not need to be created. It appears automatically when nothing is held against the flow. Energy has never required awareness to justify its movement, and it does not become more real when it is noticed or less real when it is ignored. It moves beneath attention with the same steadiness, carrying warmth, motion, and quiet transformation through every layer of existence without asking to be followed. What awareness often experiences as letting go is simply energy shifting into a form that no longer concentrates itself into effort. Nothing essential changes in this shift. Energy does not withdraw. It redistributes itself into a wider, calmer pattern where nothing stands out sharply enough to demand response. As this redistribution deepens, the sense of separation between moments begins to soften. One experience no longer replaces another. They blend gently, overlapping in a way that feels continuous rather than sequential. Energy flowing in this way does not mark beginnings or endings. It does not announce transitions. It simply carries influence forward until it becomes indistinguishable from the background of experience itself. This is why deep rest often feels like sinking rather than stopping. Movement continues, but it no longer rises to the surface of awareness. Forms that once felt solid begin to feel transparent in this state, not because they disappear, but because energy no longer presses against their edges. Identity loosens, not through loss, but through diffusion. The sense of being someone doing something gives way to being something that is simply being carried. Energy supports this shift quietly, maintaining balance while releasing unnecessary tension. Nothing needs to be held together manually. The work of continuation happens on its own. Within the body, this appears as a gentle spreading of sensation rather than focused feeling. Warmth moves without direction. Breath completes itself without being noticed. Muscles soften without instruction. Energy continues its circulation, but it does so evenly enough that no single signal rises above the rest. This evenness creates safety without effort, allowing the system to remain coherent while attention drifts freely. Time loses its sharp edges here. It does not stretch or compress dramatically. It simply becomes irrelevant. Energy moving smoothly through time no longer needs to be counted, measured, or anticipated. The mind stops checking what comes next because nothing is missing from what is already happening. Continuation fills the entire field of experience, leaving no gap that needs to be closed. There is nothing temporary about this calm. Even though it does not insist on staying, energy can gather again later, sharpen into focus, return to activity when conditions invite it. For now, it prefers breadth over intensity, softness over precision. This preference is not chosen. It emerges naturally when nothing interrupts the flow. Rest does not need to be protected. It sustains itself as long as energy is allowed to move without resistance. Energy continues beneath all states, beneath wakefulness and sleep alike, carrying continuity forward in forms that require less and less effort as attention loosens. Nothing important depends on staying alert. Nothing meaningful depends on staying aware. Energy has never depended on either, and it will continue long after both have softened into quieter expressions. Energy does not compress itself into moments unless something forces it to, and when nothing is forcing it, it naturally expands into a wide, even presence that fills experience without concentrating anywhere in particular. In this expanded state, energy no longer feels like movement traveling from one point to another, but like a continuous field that everything happens within. Nothing enters it, and nothing exits it sharply. Sensations emerge from it and return to it so gradually that the boundary between appearing and fading becomes almost impossible to locate. This is not because energy has slowed to a stop, but because it has spread itself so evenly across time and awareness that no single change stands out strongly enough to demand attention. As energy continues in this softened, distributed way, the mind gradually loses its habit of tracking progression. There is no clear sense of where one thought ends and another begins, because energy no longer separates them into distinct events. Instead, impressions blend into one another, forming a gentle continuity that feels more like atmosphere than sequence. The need to understand what is happening dissolves, not because understanding has failed, but because nothing is being presented in a way that requires interpretation. Energy supports experience without organizing it into tasks or narratives, allowing awareness to remain open without effort. This openness is deeply stable, even though it contains no fixed structure. Energy moving without resistance does not create chaos, it creates balance. The body remains supported, the nervous system remains regulated, and internal processes continue to function quietly in the background without needing supervision. Warmth circulates, breath completes itself, subtle internal movements maintain coherence, all carried by energy that no longer concentrates into urgency or demand. Stability here does not come from holding things in place, but from allowing movement to distribute itself evenly. Time becomes increasingly difficult to locate in this state, not because it disappears, but because energy no longer marks it sharply. Moments no longer arrive as discrete units that replace one another. They overlap, soften, and merge, forming a continuous duration that feels neither fast nor slow. The past does not pull forward, and the future does not announce itself. Everything that is happening feels sufficient in itself, leaving no gap that needs to be filled by anticipation. Energy carries experience forward so smoothly that the direction of time becomes irrelevant. Even the sense of being present begins to diffuse gently. Awareness no longer needs to anchor itself to a center or a point of focus. It spreads naturally, becoming less defined and more spacious without losing coherence. Energy supports this diffusion by maintaining gentle circulation throughout the entire field of experience, preventing collapse while allowing softness. Identity loosens not through loss, but through expansion, becoming wide enough that nothing needs to be held tightly to remain intact. There is no signal that this process has reached a destination, because it is not moving toward one. Energy does not arrive at rest. It times becomes time's rest by distributing itself in a way that removes strain from continuation. Nothing needs to stop for this to happen. Nothing needs to end. Movement simply becomes quiet enough that it feels like stillness, even though it continues uninterrupted beneath awareness. This is the state energy naturally prefers when nothing interferes with its flow, and it will remain this way for as long as attention does not attempt to gather it back into urgency. Energy does not recognize the need to gather itself unless something interrupts its natural spread. And when interruption fades, energy immediately begins to widen again, filling experience so evenly that nothing feels separate enough to stand out. In this widened state, movement is no longer perceived as motion traveling across space or time, but as a constant presence supporting everything simultaneously. Sensations do not arrive from outside and disappear inward. They emerge gently within this field and dissolve back into it without friction, leaving no clear boundary between beginning and fading. This continuity is not passive. It is active in the quietest possible way, maintaining balance without announcing effort. As energy continues to distribute itself without resistance, the mind gradually releases its tendency to measure experience. There is no internal clock to check, no sequence to track, no progression that needs to be followed. Thought loses its urgency because energy no longer compresses itself into sharp points that demand resolution. Instead, impressions hover briefly and then blend into the surrounding calm, forming a soft texture rather than a chain of events. Awareness remains present, but it no longer positions itself as an observer standing apart from what is happening. It becomes part of the same continuous field. Within the body, this state reveals itself as a deep and unforced coherence. Muscles remain supported without holding tension. Breath moves without being guided. Subtle internal rhythms continue their work quietly, carried by energy that is evenly spread rather than concentrated. Nothing needs to be adjusted. Nothing needs to be corrected. Energy flows through familiar pathways that have long learned how to remain open without supervision, allowing the system to rest while remaining intact. Time, in this condition, feels less like movement forward and more like depth. Moments do not replace one another. They accumulate gently, layering into a continuous presence that feels wide rather than long. The past does not intrude, and the future does not call. Energy moving smoothly through time leaves no sharp markers, making duration feel almost weightless. Experience does not rush, but it does not pause either. It simply remains available without pressure. The sense of self continues to soften as energy supports experience without requiring focus. Identity no longer needs to assert itself through thought or intention. It becomes a background pattern sustained by gentle circulation rather than active maintenance. Nothing essential is lost in this diffusion. Coherence remains, but it no longer insists on being defined. Awareness widens until it feels less like something located in a body and more like a space within which the body is resting. There is no edge to this process, no moment when continuation becomes something else. Energy does not signal completion because it is not completing anything. It is simply expressing itself in its least demanding form. Movement becomes so even that it feels like stillness. Presence becomes so broad that it feels like absence. Yet nothing has stopped. Nothing has vanished. Energy continues to support existence quietly, effortlessly, without needing attention to remain real. Energy has no preference for being noticed, and when attention relaxes enough to stop following it, energy does not change direction or slow down in response. It continues exactly as it always has, spreading itself evenly across experience, allowing everything it touches to remain supported without emphasis. In this state, nothing arrives with urgency and nothing departs with finality. Sensations rise gently within the same field they dissolve into. Thoughts hover briefly and then soften back into the background, and awareness remains open without needing to focus on any particular point. Movement becomes so evenly distributed that it no longer feels like movement at all, but like a stable presence within which change can occur without disturbance. As this stability deepens, the mind's tendency to separate experience into parts begins to loosen. There is less distinction between inside and outside, between what is happening and what is being observed. Energy does not draw lines between these categories. It flows through them without interruption, making separation feel unnecessary. Awareness does not collapse when these distinctions fade. It widens, becoming less defined and more spacious, supported by energy that no longer gathers itself into effort or intent. Nothing needs to be understood here, because nothing is being presented as a problem to solve. The body rests naturally within this widening field. Posture settles without adjustment. Muscles release not because they are told to, but because energy no longer signals them to remain alert. Breath completes itself in long, quiet cycles that do not need counting. Subtle internal processes continue steadily, carried by energy that has learned how to remain present without demanding attention. This rest is not fragile. It does not depend on maintaining a particular position or state. It sustains itself as long as nothing interferes with the flow. Time continues to soften as energy moves through it without marking sharp divisions. Experience no longer feels as though it is progressing towards something else. Each moment contains enough continuity that nothing feels missing. The sense of waiting dissolves, replaced by a gentle completeness that does not need explanation. Energy does not hurry time forward, and time does not constrain energy. They move together quietly, forming a depth of experience rather than a sequence of events. Identity continues to diffuse without disappearing. There is still coherence, still presence, but it no longer centers itself around effort, intention, or control. Energy supports identity the same way it supports breath and circulation, quietly and without demand. The need to hold a sense of self together fades because nothing is threatening to pull it apart. Continuation does not require vigilance. It happens naturally when energy is allowed to move without resistance. There is no moment when this process needs to end, because it is not leading anywhere. Energy does not arrive at rest as a destination. It expresses rest by distributing itself so evenly that nothing strains against anything else. Movement becomes background, presence becomes wide. Silence emerges not from absence, but from balance. Everything continues, gently and steadily, without asking to be followed, corrected, or completed. Energy does not gather itself unless something interrupts its natural spread. And when interruption fades completely, energy resumes its widest and calmest expression without hesitation. In this state, nothing presses forward and nothing pulls back. Experience unfolds within a steady field that does not fluctuate sharply enough to require reaction. Sensations emerge softly, remain briefly, and dissolve so gradually that their edges become indistinguishable from the space they arise within. Movement does not announce itself, and stillness does not need to be created. Both coexist as different expressions of the same continuous flow. As this flow remains uninterrupted, awareness no longer needs to orient itself. There is no internal reference point to return to, no external signal to track. Energy supports perception without dividing it into foreground and background. Everything exists at the same depth, evenly supported, allowing attention to rest without needing to choose where to settle. The effort to remain aware fades naturally, not because awareness disappears, but because nothing requires it to be held tightly. Within the body, energy continues to circulate evenly, supporting balance without tension. Muscles soften not as an action, but as a consequence of no longer needing readiness. Breath moves through long, unbroken cycles that do not ask to be guided. Internal rhythms maintain coherence quietly, carried forward by energy that no longer concentrates itself into alertness. This coherence is not maintained through effort. It sustains itself because nothing is working against it. Time becomes increasingly diffuse as energy flows through it without carving moments apart. Experience does not feel like a line moving forward, nor like a point standing still. It feels like depth that remains open and sufficient. Nothing arrives too soon, and nothing lingers too long. Energy does not mark transitions sharply, allowing the sense of duration to soften into something that feels wide rather than measured. The sense of identity continues to relax within this widening field. There is still presence, still coherence, but no need to define it actively. Energy supports identity as a background pattern rather than a central task. The urge to maintain, to check, or to confirm fades because nothing is being threatened. Continuation does not require protection. It unfolds on its own. There is no moment when this state needs to resolve into something else. Energy does not seek completion. It expresses balance by remaining evenly distributed, allowing existence to continue without emphasis. Movement becomes quiet enough to feel like rest, and rest becomes active enough to sustain continuation. Nothing ends here. Everything continues gently, without instruction, without demand, without interruption. Energy does not distinguish between foreground and background. And when attention relaxes enough to stop assigning importance, energy reveals its most stable quality, which is evenness. In this evenness, nothing is emphasized and nothing is neglected. Sensations do not compete for awareness, and silence does not need to be protected. Everything exists within the same calm field, supported equally, allowing experience to feel complete without needing to be organized. Energy moves through this field quietly, maintaining continuity without gathering itself into peaks or releasing itself into emptiness. As this balance persists, the sense of effort dissolves almost entirely. There is no internal signal that something must be done next, no subtle tension suggesting that attention should return to a task. Energy no longer feeds urgency, and without urgency, the structures that depend on it begin to soften. Thought slows not by force, but by lack of fuel. Awareness remains present, but it no longer positions itself as a controller or observer. It becomes part of the same flow it once tried to manage. Within the body, this state is reflected as a deep and reliable support that does not fluctuate. Muscles remain relaxed without collapsing. Breath continues in long, unbroken rhythms that feel sufficient without being deepened deliberately. Circulation distributes warmth evenly, leaving no area demanding adjustment. Energy sustains these processes quietly, without requiring monitoring, allowing the system to rest while remaining coherent and whole. Time fades into the background as energy flows through it, without marking change sharply enough to be counted. Moments do not announce their arrival or departure. They overlap softly, forming a continuous duration that feels neither long nor short. The mind no longer searches for transitions because nothing feels incomplete. Energy carries experience forward so smoothly that the sense of progression becomes unnecessary. Identity continues to loosen without dissolving. There is still a sense of being, but it is no longer anchored to definition or intention. Energy supports presence as a gentle pattern rather than a central focus. The need to maintain a sense of self relaxes because nothing is challenging it. Continuation does not depend on vigilance. It unfolds naturally when energy is allowed to remain evenly distributed. There is no threshold to cross here, no deeper state waiting beyond this one. Energy does not move toward resolution. It expresses stability by remaining open, calm, and uninterrupted. Movement becomes indistinguishable from rest, and rest becomes indistinguishable from presence. Everything continues in this way quietly, without requiring attention, without demanding understanding, without ever needing to come to an end. Energy does not gather itself into focus unless something insists on direction, and when that insistence fades completely, energy naturally expands into its most effortless form, spreading itself evenly across awareness and time until nothing feels concentrated enough to demand attention. In this state, experience no longer presents itself as a sequence of events that need to be followed or understood, but as a continuous field in which sensations, thoughts, and silence arise and dissolve without friction. Nothing pushes forward, and nothing pulls back. Movement continues, but it does so without emphasis, becoming so smooth that it feels indistinguishable from stillness. This is not a special condition that must be reached, but the default state. Energy returns to whenever resistance softens and urgency releases. As this even distribution persists, the mind gradually abandons its habit of checking, measuring, and orienting itself. There is no longer a need to ask what is happening or what should come next, because energy no longer presents experience in a way that requires response. Impressions drift through awareness gently, overlapping and blending rather than replacing one another. Thought loses its edges and becomes texture rather than content. Awareness remains present, but it no longer feels positioned anywhere in particular. It widens naturally, supported by energy that has stopped gathering itself into points of effort or intention. Within the body, this widening reveals itself as a deep, reliable coherence that does not depend on posture, control, or correction. Muscles soften without collapsing. Breath moves through long, unbroken cycles that do not need to be counted or deepened. Circulation distributes warmth evenly, leaving no area demanding attention. Energy continues its work quietly, maintaining balance without signaling urgency. The body rests not because it is shut down, but because nothing is asking it to remain alert. Stability here is not held in place. It sustains itself through uninterrupted flow. Time becomes increasingly diffuse, as energy moves through it without carving moments into sharp divisions. Experience does not feel like it is moving forward or standing still. It feels like depth that remains open and sufficient. The past does not pull, and the future does not announce itself. Everything that is happening feels complete enough that nothing needs to be anticipated. Energy carries continuity forward so smoothly that duration becomes almost unnoticeable, and in that unnoticeability, strain dissolves naturally. The sense of identity continues to soften within this field without disappearing. There is still a quiet coherence, still a sense of being, but it no longer centers itself around effort, intention, or self-reference. Energy supports identity the same way it supports breath and warmth, as a background pattern rather than a task. The need to maintain or protect a sense of self relaxes because nothing is threatening to disrupt it. Continuation does not require vigilance. It unfolds automatically when energy is allowed to remain evenly distributed across experience. There is no moment when this process needs to resolve into something else, because it is not moving toward an end point. Energy does not arrive at rest as a destination. It expresses rest by distributing itself so evenly that nothing presses against anything else. Movement becomes background, presence becomes wide. Silence emerges not from absence, but from balance. Everything continues quietly in this way, without instruction, without demand, without interruption, carried forward by energy that has never needed attention in order to remain. Energy does not arrive at a conclusion, because nothing in the universe was ever designed to conclude in the way the mind expects. What the mind calls an ending is simply a place where energy has spread so evenly that nothing remains distinct enough to be followed. In this final softening, experience no longer organizes itself into moments, meanings, or directions. Sensations arise as gentle impressions and dissolve before they can be named. Thoughts lose their shape before they can connect. Silence does not replace sound, and stillness does not replace motion. Everything blends into a continuous presence where nothing is missing and nothing is required. Energy does not stop here. It becomes so evenly distributed that stopping is no longer a meaningful concept. As this distribution deepens, awareness no longer feels like something that belongs to a body or a point of view. It becomes a wide, open field in which the body itself is resting. Breath continues without being noticed. Circulation continues without being felt. Subtle internal movements maintain balance without ever asking for attention. Energy supports all of this quietly, without gathering itself into effort or intent. Nothing is held together deliberately. Nothing is allowed to fall apart. Continuation happens on its own, steady and reliable, because nothing interferes with it. Time no longer appears as a line or a sequence. It does not move forward, and it does not stand still. It becomes depth, wide and sufficient, carrying experience without marking its passage. The past does not return, and the future does not approach. Everything that is happening feels complete enough that nothing else needs to happen next. Energy flows through time so smoothly that duration dissolves into presence, leaving no edge where awareness needs to attach itself. Identity relaxes fully in this state, not disappearing, not dissolving, but becoming unnecessary. There is no need to know who is experiencing this calm, because nothing is being asked of experience. Energy maintains coherence without definition, supporting existence without requiring a center. The sense of being remains, but it no longer refers to anything. It simply rests within the same flow that carries everything else. There is no deeper layer beyond this one, no final realization waiting further ahead. Energy does not move toward insight or completion. It expresses balance by remaining uninterrupted. Movement becomes background, presence becomes wide, silence becomes full. Everything continues exactly as it should, without effort, without correction, without awareness needing to remain awake or asleep. Nothing ends here. Nothing begins again. Energy continues, evenly and endlessly, and because it does, everything else is free to rest.